Chapter 18, Section 2, as we continue on with the civil rights movement. This is specific to the Montgomery bus boycott. It's probably the one that's one of the most famous, with the Rosa Parks thing and that whole concept. Um, but again, the origins of nonviolent protest, kind of mentioned this a little bit in Section 1 lecture outline, but Gandhi was one of the originators. But actually, it was a man by the name of Henry David Thoreau. Um, who came up with the concept of what was referred to as civil disobedience. In other words, I'm going to disobey a law or a whatever, but I'm going to do it in a civil way, meaning I'm going to do it in a way that's not causing violence, not causing anybody any harm, but it is specifically targeted towards disobeying a law. And this can be traced back to the mid to late 1800s. But as I mentioned, it was Gandhi who really put that practice into play when he worked towards gaining equal rights for many um, Indians in South Africa, and also worked in India specifically to kind of eradicate India from British rule. In other words, work towards British independence, which eventually happens in the 1940s. Dr. King takes on this type of strategy as he kind of maneuvers his way throughout the South as a civil rights movement, connoisseur, so to speak. Other people involved in this were a man by the name of James Lawson. We mentioned CORE earlier in the lecture outline. He was one of the founding members of CORE, and was a very prominent figure in actual workshops and teaching of nonviolent protest. Um, Here you have John Lewis, who was another individual. You'll see him come into play during the Selma March. Some of you might be familiar with that. He was also a senator from Georgia, I believe, for a long period of time. Just recently died in the last probably 5 years or so. And then Diane Nash, who was a student in Nashville. Um, and she was part of what was referred to as SNCC, which was the organization that very similar to Dr. King's organization, except it was a student organization. So, in addition to Dr. King, there's other prominent African American civil rights leaders, workers who were instrumental in this concept of civil rights. So these methods of nonviolent protests included marches, boycotts, sit-ins, any type of, again, civil disobedient type of, we're not breaking windows, we're not starting fires, we're not, rioting. Although unfortunately that becomes an issue in the latter part of the 1960s. But at this point, it was a way of training civil rights workers not to react to any type of physical attack. The human nature is if someone, attacks you, you want to attack them back. But part of the civil rights movement training concept was you have to keep your discipline, keep your cool, and not react. That's going to be more powerful than, reacting in a violent way. The backstory to the Montgomery bus boycott. Montgomery was a very prominent Southern state. As a matter of fact, it was the capital of the Confederacy back during the 1860s. So segregation and Jim Crow laws, as we'll talk about, was a big part of their society. Whether it was the state laws, local laws, it legalized racial segregation. So it played on the Plessy v. Ferguson court case that was ruled upon in 1896, and it basically ignored, the statute established by Brown versus Board of Ed, which made segregation illegal. Jim Crow was not a person. It was it was a cartoon character, and it was a very racially based cartoon character that was, kind of the symbol of African Americans in the South. And the Jim Crow laws were a collection of local and state type of ordinances that work to disenfranchise African Americans. In other words, keep them from voting um, through literacy tests, poll taxes, constitutional quizzes, anything that would prevent African Americans from being able to exercise their rights in the 14th or 15th and amendments to the Constitution, whether that was in employment, whether it was right to education, or just other basic rights like riding on a bus in this case. Um, these Jim Crow laws were all established to prevent, African Americans from actually being able to exercise their constitutional rights. And as I mentioned, Montgomery was one of the most strictly segregated cities in the South. So we're not talking about a moderate, like, we talk about Arkansas being a moderate type of southern state. Um, Montgomery, Alabama, not so much. So a boycott again is a way of non-violently protesting, right? It's part of that element of civil disobedience. Um, and there's a lot of misinformation I feel like about the Rosa Parks situation. Um, but basically, what happened, the story goes, as you say, that she originally got on the bus in downtown Montgomery and sat where she was supposed to sit based on the local ordinances, sat in the back of the bus. And it's not like you have to go all the way to the back seat. It was literally this: black people were required to sit in a row of seats that was behind the the furthest white person, whoever that was, right? So if there was white people sitting in the first 6 rows of the bus, then the African American passengers had to go to the 7th row and sit. And then in the process, I should say, if more white people got on the bus and no longer were the 6 rows available, then the white people would go to the 7th and the 8th or whatever, and then the black people would have to stand up and move back, further back. And that's what happened in the Rosa Parks case. When she originally got on the bus, she sat where she was supposed to sit. And as the bus kind of toured through downtown Montgomery, more and more white people started to, board the bus. And that's when she said, "I'm not moving." I'm sick and tired of this stuff. It was her, kind of a paraphrase quote. And she refused to get up and give her seat to the white man, I believe, that um, was wanting her seat. Now she was sitting next to 2 black men. Rosa Parks was. Those 2 men got up and moved, as the local ordinance would suggest or would require them to. She did not, and that started the whole thing. She was arrested, convicted. I think she was fined $10 or something. It's like not a major crime. Not going to go to jail for 3 years for it. But the point was that's what they were looking for. More information. Rosa Parks was not the sweet. I should say this. Rosa Parks was a lot of people portray her as a sweet little old lady that just was tired and didn't want to move back. She was more than that. She was an active civil rights member of the local chapter there in the NAACP of Montgomery. And she was a trained civil rights worker. She knew exactly what she was doing. And the local NAACP in Montgomery had kind of planned for this type of situation. They had an idea. They were ready to kind of put an emotion into a plan. They knew exactly what they were going to do if this situation ever came up. And they were looking for the right individual. This was not unusual. There were other African Americans who were arrested for doing the same thing she did prior to that, but the NAACP didn't act because they felt like it wasn't the right person to act for. For instance, there was one teenage girl, who was African American, who did the same thing Rosa Parks did, wouldn't move back. She was arrested, but she was a teenager, and she was pregnant at the time, and so they were like, it's not the person that we want representing our movement. So they waited, and then the Rosa Parks things happened, and that now, okay, this is the right situation. Let's step into it. Um, Parks and Rec set off a plan, as I mentioned. They organized or had already had initial plans for the boycott of the busing. Now, the busing companies, um, relied on black passengers. About two-thirds of their passengers typically were African Americans because a lot of them didn't have cars, so they relied on the public transportation, the buses in this case. And so the local bus companies were economically like, you know, affected as a result of two-thirds of their riders are not there. You can see the picture there. It's like nobody on the bus except one white girl, lady, whatever. Um, so that's what a boycott does. It's boycotting a certain product or a certain service in this case, and that was their strength. And they knew that eventually economics would take over, and people would say, "All right, maybe it's not such a bad idea we integrate. We can't afford two-thirds of our revenue stream to be gone as a result." Um, this is where Dr. King steps in. He was relatively unknown at the time, living in Montgomery. He was actually from Atlanta, Georgia, but he had just recently moved to Montgomery. He was a practicing pastor in one of the local Baptist church there. And he was like randomly, not randomly, I guess, he was selected to be the spokesperson of the boycott. A very well spoken individual. I'm sure you've seen speeches. He was incredibly talented public speaker, represented the African American community in a way that they wanted to be represented. And so he was the guy. He became, the face of the civil rights movement starting here in late 1950s. I don't know why it's doing that, but anyways, what he organized, what was referred to as the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the organization where all of the protests were being kind of facilitated through. And he made sure that everybody followed the rules. Like, this is how we're going to do this. Everybody's got to be on the same page. We can't have people going off doing their own thing relative to the boycott. You can't be, breaking windows, or you can't be mouthing off, even though you may want to, but we got to stay consistent in our approach. And if we don't, our whole um, movement will fracture and fall apart. We got to stay on the same page. And that was extremely important to the concept of the civil rights movement. Of course, the bus riders were, the African Americans were harassed, especially those who try to organize carpools and things of that sort. Even to the point where insurance companies would cancel auto insurances for people who would carpool, African Americans to and from work or to and from the store or whatever. King and other African American leaders were targeted with violent threats and fire bombs and just crazy stuff that went on. But they had to kind of stay the course. We can't overreact. We can't react at all, as a matter of fact, to keep this thing going forward. We can't allow them to get us off our plan. The results of the boycott was successful. It lasted almost over a year, I believe, from the time it was initiated, although the original plan was only supposed to be for one day. But they had such buy-in, they had such support from the African American community that they decided that they're going to continue it until they integrate the bus. And so in June of 1956, Montgomery Federal Court ruled that law requiring racially segregated busing violated the 14th Amendment. Like I mentioned in the other lecture, the 14th Amendment was important. And so basically, African Americans being required to ride in the back of the bus was illegal. And by federal law, again, federal law trumps local law. So Supreme Court ruled in the favor of the boycotters, and buses were integrated during that time period. Of course, the city tried to appeal the federal court decision. That didn't go very well. And eventually the buses are integrated, and it was a huge victory for the civil rights movement in relation to other movements as we start to move forward. They found out that nonviolent protest was successful. Continuity and following the plan for civil rights movement was important. And they knew that if they did the right thing and stayed to their plan, that eventually things would go in the right direction. 381 days the boycott actually took place. So it was over a year and whatever, 2 weeks. So December 21st, 1956, the buses were integrated for the first time, and Rosa Parks was one of the first individuals to ride on a bus that was integrated. As a result of the bus boycott, kind of the cause and effect, right? One of the effects is that there was an establishment of what was referred to as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, an organization that's still around today, I believe. And they understood they needed a centralized group, a centralized leading platform that would organize all civil rights protests throughout the South. They couldn't have people going rogue on them. They couldn't have like, three different organizations running their show different ways. They had to be consistent with their approach. And Dr. King was the leader of that. And he was the one who facilitated all the other little protests that are springing up. Hey, we've got to do it this way. And we got to do it the right way. Otherwise, we're going to have fractures in the movement. So the Southern Christian Leadership Council facilitated all of the different organizations under that cloud, under that umbrella that all other civil rights protests would be run under. All right, that's it for this part of it. We'll continue on with other parts here a little bit later on, but this is section 2 of chapter 18, the Montgomery Bus Boycott.